live. I'll write it and we'll do it live. And thing sucks.
You got to pump it up, don't you know? Pump it up. You got to pump it up, don't you know? Pump it up. You got to pump it up, don't you know? Pump it up. You got to pump it up, don't you know? Pump it up. You got to pump it up, don't you know? Pump it up. You got to pump it up, don't you know? Pump it up. You got to pump it up, don't you know? Pump it up. You got to pump it up, don't you know? Pump it up. You got to pump it up, don't you know? Pump it up. You got to pump it up, don't you know? Pump it up. You got to pump it up, don't you know? Pump it up.
Trent, I would say happy Monday to you, but this does not feel like a happy Monday. This does not feel like a happy Monday, at least within this fan base.
Kind of like a somber Monday.
Somber Monday, lunatic Monday, losing your damn minds Monday. I don't know what we should call it, but my goodness, dude, this Michigan fan base is has officially gone off the rails. And it's not all of you. Not all of you are crazy and insane and off your rocker, but man, there is a good portion of this fan base that just dude, they don't know how to handle it. They don't know how to handle a couple of losses. And, you know, this idea that what we had experienced over the last 3 years was just going to continue without any speed bumps, without any issues, particularly with the departure of Jim Harbaugh and the departure of 18 guys during the offseason. You know, you lose an NFL offensive line, you lose your starting quarterback, you lose Blake Corum, you lose Mike Sainristil. I mean, you lose, you know, guys that are the heartbeat of your program, and everybody just thinks, Matt, who gives a shit? Continue on, continue to win week by week. Look, I don't think that it's unfair to expect this team to continue to be successful. But Trent, we've got people after week 6, 4-2 Michigan. It's not just Wink Martindale needs to be fired. It's not just Kurt Campbell needs to be fired. There are people that want Sharon Moore out. There are people that think this experiment through 6 weeks is not going to work. It's complete insanity. Have you seen any of this on social media? I mean, you're a guy who's on Twitter a lot, and you know that's where we see a lot of it happening. But I mean, do you see this? And I guess what is your response to this idea that we've seen enough from Sharon Moore? It's already time to make a decision.
Yeah, I've seen plenty of it. I've seen Sharon Moore needs fired. The whole coaching staff needs fired. Michigan's they're not going to win another game the rest of the season. It's it's a lot out there. Michigan's coming off of a national championship, and the fan base is, to be honest, I think Michigan fans have kind of been spoiled the last 3 years of winning the Big Ten and beating Ohio State and winning the national championship.
Spoiled Michigan fans, you say? No, come on now.
And so even though Harbaugh left, you still think you have Will Johnson coming back and Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant and so on and so forth. And you think Michigan, they should still be king of the mountains. And, you know, maybe they really should be. I don't know. But realistically, that's not where this team's at. And I entered 10-2. I think you were around the same boat. And
9-3.
We had to lower our expectations for this team kind of pretty much right away, too, after that Texas game. And I think that fans, they're not coming to terms with exactly what this Michigan team is. And I think a lot of people still think this team should be winning blowout games, and it's just not the case. But going to Sharon Moore specifically, no, it's 6 games into his tenure. You can't say that this guy needs fired. You got to give him a couple years and see what happens. I think that, heck, I know I was this way when he hired his coaching staff. I think a lot of people thought he did a really good job. You're talking about the whole defensive side of the ball. That what left with Jim Harbaugh. All those position coaches were gone. He went out and hired brand new staffs. He had to bring in a couple of guys from the offensive side of the ball. He promoted Kurt Campbell to offensive coordinator. That was my only question mark going into the season. Was I wasn't sure how Kurt Campbell would do as the OC. He really hasn't had the experience that you would want to be the offensive coordinator at Michigan. So I think we're seeing that a little bit, but at the same time, in his defense, it's not like Michigan has fantastic personnel on the offensive side of the ball either. But Chris, what's your take on Sharon Moore?
Well, I'll say this. I mean, I think it's fair. Criticisms at this point through 6 weeks are fair. Criticism for the entire coaching staff, for Wink Martindale, for Kurt Campbell, and even for Sharon Moore. I don't think that these guys shouldn't be facing some criticism for what we've seen play out. But this idea that after 6 weeks in the guy's first year, you're all ready to shit can him, you're all ready to fire the guy for going 4-2. I just think it's like, I was thinking about this the other night. I'm like, let's just say, I mean, there's a lot of Detroit Lions fans out here that follow us and follow Michigan football. Like, if Detroit had gone out and won the Super Bowl last year, and they were 6 weeks into the season this year, sitting at 4-2, coming off of a 27-17 loss to Seattle, is anybody really pounding the table, demanding for the head coach to be fired? Like, it's just, this is something so uniquely college football, and I think it's part of what makes this sport just different than all the rest. This idea that you just want to shuffle pieces all the time, and if it's not working as quickly as you think it needs to work, then these people got to go. And it's not a realistic way to approach things. And so, when it comes to Sharon Moore specifically, I do think that there are things that need to be addressed. And I think that there's conversations that need to be had with a guy like Wink Martindale in the way that they're running this defense. I will say this. I don't know how much of it is the combination or how much of it is specifically on Wink Martindale and the scheme he wants to run versus the personnel, because I think that when you look at Michigan from a personnel standpoint, they should have the guys that are able to execute Wink Martindale's scheme. But this defense looks very undisciplined. They look out of position quite often. And because of that, even if you're Wink Martindale and you want to run a specific type of scheme, at some point you've got to look at the film and say, look, for as much as I think of these guys and what they're capable of, they can't do it. We got to adjust, and we got to do a better job of putting them in a position to succeed. And that conversation ultimately falls on Sharon Moore to be able to go to Wink Martindale and say, look, I know I brought you in here. This is the type of defense you want to run. We got to make some adjustments here. Same conversation needs to be had with Kurt Campbell. After the game, and I put this article out, I saw former Wolverine Khaleke Hudson on Twitter saying, like, after the Washington game, did we even attempt a pass like downfield, like a deep ball? And the answer is no. And Michigan doesn't do that. There is no vertical threat through the air from this Michigan offense. And so when you take those things into account, that's a decision that you make if you're Kurt Campbell. And I know that last week during the press conference, he had said, there's things on the sheet, there's plays that we want to be able to call, but the offense needs to execute certain things in order for us to be able to do that. I do think that's true to a certain extent, but damn it, like, you got to attempt some downfield passes. You've got to show that you're at least willing to do that in order to give a defense something to think about. And so far, Michigan hasn't been able to do that. So the criticism I would have of Sharon Moore at this point isn't necessarily related to personnel, and we'll get to that, and in particular, the quarterback conversation. But my criticism of Sharon Moore, and I don't even know if it's a criticism at this point, but I would say this. Heading into the bye week, you are the head coach of this football team. You have now watched your defense struggle through 6 weeks. You have watched your offense struggle through 6 weeks. You have one of the worst offenses in college football, and your defense is one of the worst against the pass. You need to step in, and you need to reset the deck, and you need to talk to your coordinators about what you want to see moving forward in terms of putting your guys in the best position to succeed. So I do think that is a fair criticism and a fair expectation from Sharon Moore, is that now you've seen it, now you got to make some changes. These are the guys you put in place, but ultimately you've got to get the players to where they need to be. I guess that's how I'd respond to how I feel about Sharon Moore after 6 weeks. I mean, is that out of line? Is that too soft? Is that giving him a free pass?
No, I don't think so. Like I said, I believe when he hired all these position coaches, we all thought they were good hires.
Correct.
Wink Martindale, man, he's getting a ton of crap right now, but when they hired him, I know there was concerns about his age and this and that, but he literally helped invent the scheme that Michigan's running. Like, if you wanted to keep the players and what they have been doing the past 3 years, I felt like it was a home run hire. Whether it is all on Wink, the players, I think it's probably a good combination. I don't think the Michigan players are nearly as good as what they were last season, mainly in the secondary. I actually, at some point in time, I want to talk to you about that. I have some stats I want to just talk about, but I feel like Sharon did what he had to do this offseason with what he was left with. Like, again, Jim Harbaugh left late in the cycle. JJ McCarthy left. There wasn't a whole lot there was nothing out there transfer wise. He plucked in some secondary guys. They haven't panned out, but he did things that we all thought that he was going to be good for Michigan. And then, I mean, clearly they're 4-2. There are a ton of concerns and questions. I guess if I have any criticism of Sharon Moore, it is that Michigan has yet to play 60 minutes of football. We didn't have that. We didn't really see those issues with Jim Harbaugh, mainly the past 3 years. Michigan would come out. They would typically play pretty good, but then you knew coming out of that halftime break, Michigan was going to come out and play really, really good football. And it's been opposite with this team. I don't know what they're doing in the locker room, but it just they're not coming out with fire, and they're very, very lackluster on both sides of the ball after that break. And he is the head coach. You know, it's part of his job to get these kids ready and prepared. And I guess that would be my main concern there with him.
And I think that's fair. And I was thinking about this, and I was like, you know, I felt like I was going to say it on the podcast, and I don't want it to come off the wrong way, because I mean, it's not going to come off in necessarily a good way. And we know that there's certain people that watch the show, and we want to always be respectful, right, in the way that we address things. But I think that there's a way to be respectful while also being honest. And when I look at this Michigan football team, and Trent, tell me if I'm wrong on this. When I look at this Michigan football team and I sit back and I just think about how the last 6 weeks have looked, to me, it feels very much like, do you remember what it was like when you were a kid and you walked into class and you found out that your teacher was going to be out for the day and the substitute teacher came in, and like things were just different? Like the process was a little bit sloppy. It was really like, we're just going to try to figure this thing out. There were kids that were acting up. You know, there were always problems, but kids acting up way more with the substitute than they would with the actual teacher. Like, that's how I feel this Michigan football program looks. It's like Jim Harbaugh is not in the building anymore. The teacher is out. Sharon Moore is in, and it just seems sloppy. It seems undisciplined. It seems like that thing that made Michigan so special in the last 3 years, that type of leadership, that dedication, that discipline, that commitment, it just seems to be lacking with Sharon Moore. And so I think that kind of speaks to what you're saying is, they don't play a complete game. They are out of position a lot. And it just, you know, I don't know where the leadership is on this defense. I know that Rod Moore is a captain on the defense, but he's over on the sideline. And I know that Makari Page is a captain on this defense, but have you, and to be fair, I'm only trying, you know, there's only so much I can see from my vantage point, but have you seen Makari Page rallying the troops or getting in people's faces or trying to get people in the right position? Makari Page is having his own struggles. So I don't know where the true leadership is on this defense, where you can look to somebody and be like, okay, that is the Mike Sainristil of this team. That is the Mike Barrett of this team. I know they've got a lot of talented guys, Will Johnson, Mason Graham, Kenneth Grant. They're not really starved for talent on the defensive side of the ball, which I think is why it's so puzzling that they're struggling as much as they are. But that's the overall impression I get from this football team. It's like teacher's out, substitute is in, and it just looks sloppy.
You know, that's you speaking about Makari Page and rallying the troops. To me, outside of the coaching staff changes, I feel like Michigan's lacking that leadership within the building of the players themselves. Yeah. Like last year, you could count on Trevor Keegan and Zach Center and JJ McCarthy and Blake Corum and Michael Barrett, Junior Colson to some extent. Like those guys would rally the troops and get them going.
Roman Wilson is in that list. I mean, dude, there's guys on that list.
Donovan Edwards on Saturday night was the first time that I have seen in 6 weeks any player step up in game and try to rally the troops. That was the first time that I've seen it all year. You listen to the post game at Michigan Stadium, like nobody sounds like they're leaders of this team, which is kind of scary bad when you think about how close knit this Michigan program has been the last 3 years, where you don't have that now.
Yeah, you know what I think is another indication of that? And again, I want to preface this by saying we love the guy. We think he's great. And I mean, I have had the opportunity to spend some time with him, and he's always, you know, kind and pleasant. And I really like him as an individual. And he had one of his best performances on Saturday night against Washington. Donovan Edwards, I mean, if he doesn't slip on that cutback, he is gone. He's off to the house. But in the post game, and I had sent this link to you in the post game press conference, somebody had asked him about, hey, what do you think was going on out there with the lack of traction or whatever? And Donovan Edwards, and for those of you who didn't hear it, we might be able to get you audio of that today. But Donovan Edwards had said something like, I think it may have been Vegas playing a part. And it was just like, I think he was attempting to be funny. I think he was trying to make a joke. But if you watch that video, Sherrone
didn't like it.
As soon as Donovan says, I think that might have been Vegas, Sherrone Moore turns to Donovan Edwards, and it looks like he wants to pick him up and carry him right out of the post-game press conference. Like, Sherrone Moore didn't really seem like he was happy with that type of statement. Now, I'm not going to try to read too much into that, but what I'm telling you is that the fact that that was even on his mind, the fact that that was even something that was said, that to me is just a further indication that that type of leadership and professionalism and discipline that we had come to expect with this team, that's one of your captains out there. That is probably, like, out of all the captains that during the offseason, that is like the captain, the guy who came back, the guy who's
the loudest voice for sure.
The loudest voice, the biggest personality, the guy on the cover of the college football game. Like, this is big game Don out there in a post-game press conference after a loss to Washington, say it may have been Vegas as the reason why I slipped on the turf. I just think that, bad timing, bad joke, and those are things that you got to grow from. So, yeah, overall, I think that that's probably one of the biggest factors here. And, when you looked at this team preseason, you had every reason to feel confident that Michigan could legitimately compete for a conference championship when you looked at the roster, particularly on the defensive side of the ball. And that side of the ball here through 6 weeks, I never thought we would be sitting here saying the Michigan defense is a liability, particularly in the secondary. It is a problem. And even with a guy like Will Johnson, like I know you said you want to talk about the secondary, so maybe why don't we do that? Why don't you because there's questions, there's comments in here, and I want to make sure that we don't miss it all. I am still sitting at 12:04, by the way, and it's 12:19. So I have not caught up yet, but I do want to get to some of these questions. But Trent, there was something that you wanted to address in particular about the Michigan secondary. What is it?
So I might catch some flack for saying this, but I know that everyone wants to talk about the quarterback position and what Michigan doesn't have at quarterback. Am I wrong when I say that the Michigan defense might be more of an issue than what the Michigan offense is?
Well, more of an issue.
Well, here's why. So coming into the season, everybody, whether you were a Michigan diehard or just a casual fan, you knew that the Michigan offense was likely going to struggle this year. You knew that it was going to be J.J. McCarthy and Blake Corum, Roman Wilson. You knew that you didn't have that. You were replacing all 5 starting offensive linemen, but you knew what you had in the Michigan defense, right? Everybody thought Michigan would have a top 5 defense this season.
Yeah.
So far through 6 weeks, Michigan has the 115th ranked passing defense, giving up an average of 259.8 yards per game through the air.
Yep.
Comparison, last season, Michigan was second in 15 games, second ranked, giving up 157 yards per game through the air. Now,
who did they lose out of the secondary? You lose Mike Sainristil and you lose Josh Wallace, right? Yep. Any other world? Well, you also have the loss of Rod Moore.
Keon Sabb.
Was Keon Sabb a huge factor last year? Like, he played more of a supplemental role last year. I don't know that I would, I think
he started quite a few games when Rod Moore was injured.
Sure, but you've got the Rod Moore injury during the offseason. You lose Josh Wallace and you lose Mike Sainristil, and I think that that's probably where you're seeing a lot of that. But again, still a lot of talent back there. You still have Makari Page. You still have Will Johnson. You still got Zeke Berry, who's now a junior, who was getting high praise during the offseason as the Mike Sainristil replacement. So to see that, to go from second in the nation to where are they now? 115th in the nation. In one season, I get that you lost some important guys, but my goodness, from second to 115th, and that's not the result of 1 or 2 bad games. This is 6 weeks now, 6 weeks of results. And the Michigan defense in the secondary, in the passing game, is damn near at the bottom of college football. Yep. And when you look at the teams that are below them, I would argue, you could make a strong argument that the Michigan defense, at least from a passing standpoint, is the worst in college football.
So going a little more in depth there. No, this is for 15 games. Remember that. This is for 15 games in 2023. Mike Sainristil was targeted 50 times. He allowed 29 receptions, so he allowed 58% of the passes thrown his way to be caught. Josh Wallace for 15 games was targeted 42 times, allowed 21 receptions, 50%. Now, their replacements. This is through 6 games. Jair Hill, he's been targeted 39 times. He's allowed 26 receptions for 66.7%. Zeke Berry, replacing Sainristil in the nickel, targeted 38 times, 27 receptions allowed, 71.1% of the receptions have been caught. And to add to that just a little bit more, Ernest Hausman. So he has taken on the Junior Colson role of the Michigan defense.
Yep.
Last year, Colson was targeted 36 times, allowed 25 receptions. Hausman has been targeted 30 times and has allowed 27 receptions, 90% completion rate. This Michigan secondary, you lost Mike Sainristil, Josh Wallace, and Junior Colson. And this secondary has gone downhill with the personnel they have in place right now.
Yeah, and those are the types of things that I think if you are a fan and you're angry and you're frustrated, you have every right to be angry or frustrated about that. Like that is just, there's nothing that if you're Sharon Moore that you can sit back and say that makes that excusable. And I don't think Sharon Moore is the type of guy who wants to make excuses for that. I don't think, regardless of what you think of Wink Martindale in the Michigan defense as a whole, I don't think Sharon Moore wants to make excuses for it, which is why I think it's too early to have these conversations about Sharon Moore and sort of, his job security at the University of Michigan. Do I think there are very real questions about Wink Martindale at this point? I mean, Trent, do you think that's fair based on what we've seen now through 6 weeks from this defense? Going into it, yeah, it seemed like Wink Martindale was a great hire because he came from that same sort of defensive philosophy that made Michigan so successful. He sort of coined himself as the OG of the system, and there was every reason to believe that Michigan was going to continue that level of performance under Martindale. Now through 6 weeks, I mean, this defense has gone from one of the best to, in a lot of areas, they are one of the worst in the country. And what's crazy about it is even though you lose Mike Barrett and Mike Sainristil, the personnel still on the field, when you look at Will Johnson, Makari Page, Kenneth Grant, Mason Graham, Derek Moore, Josiah Stewart, Ernest Hausman, Jayshawn Barham, who was one of the top linebackers in the Big Ten Conference last year at Maryland, when you look at who they have on the field, it is inexcusable for this Michigan defense to be performing so poorly week after week.
Yeah, I think Wink Martindale should get a ton of the blame. He is the defensive coordinator. But like I've said all season long, you can try to put them in the best spots you can, but then the players have to execute. I mean, tackling. Have we seen a Michigan defense this poor at tackling? Like their execution is beyond terrible. And once again, you're talking about guys like Zeke Berry and Ernest Hausman and Jair Hill. Honestly, Makari Page hasn't been very good this season either. I mean, I know he's a captain, he's a veteran, but he really hasn't played very well for this Michigan secondary in a lead role because you don't have Rod Moore anymore. And so now you're asking Makari Page to take that role on, and he hasn't done a whole lot with it. So, I mean, blame Wink Martindale all you want because I think you should. But I think you also need to be honest with the Michigan personnel they have defensively and realize that it's not the same that it has been the last 3 years.
Right. And a lot of that comes down to, I think, a lack of leadership. Like I said earlier, Makari Page is the only defensive captain on the field. And it just feels like they don't have that Mike Sainristil, Mike Barrett type guy that can rally the troops. And I do want to ask you this. I mean, you went through the personnel and, sort of where some of the issues are. You didn't mention Will Johnson. I want to talk about Will Johnson a little bit because now after 6 weeks, I think it's fair to have that conversation. Trent, going into the season, I mean, a lot of people, and I don't know that his draft stock has nearly changed, but viewing Will Johnson as like an early first round, I mean, shit, dude, we were writing articles where some were projecting him to go number 1 overall. Through 6 weeks, give me your honest assessment on what you've seen from Will Johnson.
Yeah, I mean, it hasn't been great. I think that possibly his injuries have been a little bit of part of that. I do believe that with teams having success throwing the football against Michigan, primarily against Hill and Barry, that we're seeing more of that breakdown even with Will Johnson, because teams are not running the football against Michigan. Michigan actually has the 5th ranked run defense in the country. So that is their strength. The front four is solid. Even the depth has been good for there. But going back to the secondary, Will Johnson, we've seen teams throw his way much more than what we've been used to the last couple of years. Granted, I mean, his potential is through the ceiling, and there's enough tape on Will Johnson where NFL teams know what he's capable of. So I still think you're looking at a top 10 pick, regardless of how the season goes. But at Michigan right now in 2024, Will Johnson's not the same player that he was.
Right. And I think that's where it's at. And it just goes to show you that the lack of discipline, like even Will Johnson isn't immune to it. You know what I mean? And I think that that's what we've seen through this season, is that he's obviously capable of making big time plays on the ball. And we've seen the pick sixes and sort of, some of the plays that he can make. But quite honestly, Will Johnson has been out of position a number of times this year. You saw it against Fresno State. They were attacking him. They were going after him. And I think if not for an errant ball, Will Johnson gives up a touchdown through the air. He gets burnt, I think, a couple of times against Fresno State. We saw it against Washington. He got burned on a route. Ball placement wasn't great, so it didn't lead to a touchdown. And then I think late in the fourth quarter, he had the defensive pass interference, right? That led to Washington getting a first down. So I think, Will Johnson is an elite football player. He is an elite cornerback. But when you have a system and a group that operates and plays undisciplined football, I think that permeates to every facet of your defense. And you can see that from every single level, from the guys up front to the second level with the linebackers, all the way to the back end with the secondary. There is a reason why this talented Michigan defense cannot put together a full 4 quarters of football. And really at the heart of it, it boils down to scheme, and it boils down to a lack of discipline. And I think those two things fall on the feet of Wink Martindale, but it ultimately gets passed up to Sharon Moore. And that's where Sharon Moore has to make a decision. I'm not saying he needs to go out and fire Wink Martindale, but you got to have a conversation with this guy and say, what we are doing defensively is not working. Our secondary is getting torched. We gave up well over 300 yards to Washington, and we are damn near last in college football in pass defense. We have to find a way to figure this out. And Wink, I need you to do it. And if you can't do it, then you got to make a decision at that point. But that's where I think we're at. There are so many people out there calling for guys and coordinators and even, Sharon Moore to be fired. We're not at that point, and Sharon Moore isn't going anywhere. He's not going anywhere this year. He's not going anywhere next year. And if we start to see these things in year 3, some things not getting corrected, then I think that conversation probably becomes a little more realistic at that point. But we're not even close to being there. But where we are at is changes need to be made in terms of the way they're going about their business. And if these coordinators don't show that they're willing to make those changes, then I think you got to make some changes in the offseason with the guys that are calling the shots. I want to try to get to some of this stuff because there were a lot of questions that came out, and I saw this one from Colin right off the bat. And again, this is at 12:04 and we are at 12:30. So if you are commenting or questioning here after 12:04, I still haven't got to you yet, but I will try to get to as many of these as I can. Colin Barron from the Facebook page, he says, do you think the lack of dude, let me read the question first, because this really irritates me. Colin says, do you think the lack of receiver production is due to the ability of the receivers, coaching, or scheme? No one seems to get consistent separation. Trent, this is something that you have talked about quite a bit, the lack of separation from the Michigan wide receivers. But to Colin's question, do you think the lack of production is due to the ability of the receivers? Is it coaching? Is it scheme? Why do you think this Michigan passing attack is so poor?
Well, here's what I think. I think if you take Tyler Morris, you take Samaj Morgan, you take Kendrick Bell, Fred Moore, and you put them on Ohio State, you put them on Oregon, you put them on any of these offenses that throw for 300 plus yards a game, I think they're probably fine. You put them on Washington with Will Rogers and the offense they run, they're probably okay.
Giles Jackson looks pretty good.
Yeah, Giles Jackson's perfectly fine. Yeah, Michigan, I will say that none of these receivers are probably true number 1 receivers. Michigan doesn't have that. They have these gadget players that are probably number 2, number 3 on a lot of teams, but the scheme doesn't help them. How many times do we see 2 receivers run a route and they're pretty identical routes that they're running, and then you throw the ball away or you take a sack or Jack Tuttle runs it for 2 yards? We see that way too often. The scheme is too vanilla. They don't scheme open receivers, that's for sure. That I keep going back to that. Yeah, receivers aren't getting separation, but this scheme is not helping them whatsoever.
Let me ask you, Trent, just on paper, forget about production right now, but if you were on paper and take, all the nonsense that we've seen through 6 weeks, going into the season, on paper, who would you have listed as Michigan's top 3 wide receiver options going into the year? Who are they?
Going into the year, I would have said Samaj Morgan, Tyler Morris, Fred Moore.
Interesting, because that's who I have down here. I have their statistics through 6 weeks. These are Michigan's top 3 wide receiver targets through 6 weeks. This is insane to me. Samaj Morgan, through 6 weeks, 13 receptions for 78 yards. That's good for an average of 2 receptions and 13 yards per game. 2 receptions and 13 yards per game. Tyler Morris, he's got 7 receptions for 51 yards on the season. That's good for an average of 1 reception and 8.5 yards per game. That's your second wide receiver, 8.5 yards per game. Frederick Moore, the guy that we heard so much about during the offseason, how, this guy was on the verge of being elite. He's turning heads. He's doing this. He's doing that. Frederick Moore through 6 weeks, he has 4 receptions for 43 yards. That's good for an average of 0.6 receptions and 7.1 yards per game. How the hell does that happen with your top 3 wideouts? Your most productive wide receiver is averaging 13 yards per game through the air through 6 weeks. That is 100% on Kurt Campbell. That is 100% on scheme. And there is not a single excuse in the world that can make that okay. I understand ground and pound. Hell, I can appreciate ground and pound. And I like the development of Khalil Mullings. And I like that 1-2 punch with Mullings and Donovan Edwards. But you cannot have your top receiver averaging 13 yards per game. I don't know how you sell that on the recruiting.
Maybe per catch, not per game.
Per catch, sure. Yeah, give that. But we're talking about numbers per game here. Dude, Tyler Morris is averaging 8 yards per game. And Kurt Campbell during the offseason singled out Tyler Morris and said, it's his time. It's his time. He's a veteran now. He's a leader on this team. It's his time. His time is 8 yards per game. 1 reception and 8 yards per game. That's what that means. So listen, it's not like I want to sit here and blow smoke and I'm trying to tell you that everything is great, because everything is not great. But that is a conversation that Sherrone Moore needs to step in as the guy who was the former OC last year. And part of it when Michigan was so successful, he needs to step in and have a very real and honest conversation with Kurt Campbell and say, this is not okay. Now, I will say this. Part of that wide receiver production or lack thereof is due to the piss poor play we've seen from the quarterbacks.
Oh,
and I think that they have gotten that figured out, even though Jack Tuttle made some critical mistakes against Washington. Dude, that touchdown pass to Colston Loveland where he dropped back, there was a little bit of pressure, he rolled out and he was, on the fly, had to hit Colston Loveland. That told me everything I needed to know. That wasn't like
He's
some
thrown to Morian Walker. We hadn't seen that all season long, and he connects to him 22 yards.
Correct, which I think is probably the longest completion through the air to a Michigan wide receiver so far this season. Like those types of plays by any stretch are not elite. You're not going to see those show up on ESPN top 10. You know what I mean? Like it's not those types of plays. But what it showed was, okay, there is the possibility for this Michigan offense to be competent through the air. And I think Jack Tuttle gives you the best option to do that. So we'll see what it looks like moving forward. But I think there's no question to me that Jack Tuttle is the guy, and you have got to get these wide receivers involved. I know that Andrew Marsh is committed, and I know that right now Andrew Olish is like kind of committed, but he's also looking elsewhere. If you don't show something through the air, how in the hell are you going to go out on the recruiting trail and sell any wide receiver? Forget about the elite wide receivers. You're not bringing them to Ann Arbor. You're never going to get a Jeremiah Smith. You're never going to get a think of any elite receiver that you can think of, either now or in the past. They are not coming to Michigan under this current formula. So it just seems to me that not just for the success of the season, but for the future success of the program, man, you have got to find a way to do something more with your wide receivers than just to use them as glorified blockers in a ground and pound offense, right?
Yeah, and that's what it comes down to. When you talk about recruiting, you're talking about bringing guys in for the next 3, 4, 5 years. Like you said, I mean, Michigan's going to be recruiting 2, 3-star receivers now, because
Right.
if you're a 4 or 5-star receiver, I'm like, hopefully Andrew Marsh stays in the class, but if you're a 4 or 5-star receiver, why would you come to Michigan?
Would you if you were Andrew Marsh?
I mean, at this rate, no. Like I would go to Texas or Texas A&M where he was being recruited. Those guys will throw you the football until Michigan can show that they can throw the football and be competent doing so. If you're a top end guy, unless you just love Michigan and that was your dream school to go to, then maybe you go there. But this kid's from Texas. He was being recruited by top end programs because he is really good. Why would you come to Michigan at this rate when they're throwing the ball 10 to 15 times a game? They run it all the time, and then you're a blocker at that rate.
I mean, could you imagine trying to sell this to a guy like Jeremiah Smith on the recruiting trail? Like, okay, listen, we're not going to offer you any money up front. We don't really throw the ball particularly well. We're going to use you as a blocker. You might average, if you're one of our top receivers, like 2 receptions a game for 13 yards. Like, can we get you to Ann Arbor? That is just, you're not going to be able to sell that to elite guys. And so to answer your question, Colin, do I think it's a matter of like the personnel, or is it the actual receivers? Is it coaching or scheme? It's coaching and scheme. There is enough talent in the wide receiver room to get far more production than 13 yards per game out of your top wide receiver. That is not personnel. That is coaching. That is scheme. That has to get better, and that has to be on Sharon Moore's plate to get that figured out now. You have to get that figured out. It's not just about this season. You are setting the deck for seasons to come. Wide receivers are going to look at that, and they're going to say, nope, that's not for me. Let's see if we can find.
And like, once again, real quick, I don't think Tyler Morris and Samaj Morgan are top flight number 1 receivers, probably anywhere, to be honest. But I think they're good enough where they should be able to average 50 to 60 yards a game. I think so, at least. And yeah, like you said, if they're averaging 13 and 8 or whatever the numbers were, that's just not acceptable.
Yeah, Maurice from the Facebook page, he says changes need to be made. Ron, Wink, and Campbell got to go. He's talking about Ron Bellamy, wide receivers coach, not somebody that we've talked about very much, but like, there's a discussion to be had there. He says this is a 7-5 team at best, and I don't think you're going to get much pushback on that either. Look, if it continues to look this way throughout the remainder of the season, I think you're going to have to see Sharon Moore make some difficult decisions regarding his staff, and it's going to be a matter of who's available and who wants to come to Michigan and how can you make that pitch. But yeah, man, if it doesn't change, I think this is part of what being the head coach means. And sometimes you got to have some difficult decisions with guys you have pretty damn good relationships with. CJ from the Facebook page, he says, why are fans blaming coaches and players, QB, for offensive issues, but only blaming Week for the defensive problems and players not executing? Obviously, he made this comment earlier at 12:08, but that's something that we talked about. And Trent, I think that's a point you made, that, yeah, you can blame Wink Martindale and the scheme and sort of how he's running things, but how many times have you seen Jair Hill out of position? How many times have you seen Will Johnson out of position? How many times have you seen mental lapses from the guys that are actually on the field, where if they were executing the way the defense is supposed to be run, maybe we're not seeing some of these issues. So CJ, I think that's a fair point. I think it's because the buck always stops with the coaches, and that's why people want to go there. It's a lot easier to criticize a guy who's in his 60s than it is to criticize a college player. And I think that, that's part of what comes along with being a coach at the University of Michigan, head coach or assistant. Maurice says that losing Ben Herbert was the biggest loss. Hey, I'm not going to push back on that. Listen, I will say, I don't know if this is being too extreme, but if I had a choice between losing Ben Herbert and Jim Harbaugh during the offseason and I could have retained one, I would have had to really think about what I wanted to do there. that's how important I think Ben Herbert was to this actual football team. I get it. Jim Harbaugh was the head coach. He was the man at the tip of the spear. But to me, Ben Herbert was at the heart of this football program. He was the guy spending more time with these players than anybody, getting them right, not just physically during the offseason, but getting them right mentally. That was like one of his specialties. He helped grow the body and the mind. And when you lose a guy like that, it is a huge, huge loss. And I think Maurice is right on point. That was arguably the biggest loss for Michigan during the offseason. Trent, would you agree there? Like, obviously, you would have liked to retain Harbaugh, but Harbaugh wasn't perfect. The annual flirtation with the NFL was becoming an issue. If you could hire Sherrone Moore and retain Ben Herbert, you probably feel pretty damn good about that.
Yeah, you talk about culture. Like, Ben Herbert was huge for this Michigan culture.
Yeah.
And how often do you hear strength coaches trying to be nominated for assistant coach of the year? Like, Jim Harbaugh was adamant that he should have been in consideration for all that he does. And I know Jim Harbaugh has his quirks and how he says off the wall things, but I think that was extremely true, that Ben Herbert was such a big part of this team.
Yep, absolutely. Dwayne Jones says it's a combination of both, but Campbell's play calling has been terrible. I literally call our plays before we run them because it's so predictable. Yeah, I mean, the Michigan offense is very predictable, and they tried to they tried to send guys in motion to try to make it look like there's going to be some creativity there. But when you do a whole lot of motion on the front end and you snap the ball just to hand it off and run a little bit of it, like I wouldn't classify that as creativity within the offense. All the pre-snap motion, to me, that doesn't do it for me. What are you doing after the ball is snapped? And Trent, to your point, are you scheming guys open? Are you scheming wide receivers open? Is the route tree good enough to get guys to where they can make a play and the quarterback can get them the ball without having to thread the needle? And we just haven't seen that from this Michigan offense so far. So that's certainly a concern. Let me continue to go down through some of these because I don't want to miss all of them. Just look at this a little bit. We got some quiet time here. Minus
what time are you on?
That's the time here. 12:13. So I'm a little bit behind. I don't want to. There's a lot of comments in here. Let me do this while we're while I'm scurrying the comments.
Stuff that just randomly pops up comments.
We need to hire somebody that can go through this and do this for me, and then can just pick out questions and then give them to us. Like that's really what we need here. But you got to have the dollars to be able to do that. And I'm full disclosure, Trent and I are. When it comes to extra dollars. Let me ask you this, because this became a big topic of conversation. I mean, if you go to the Facebook page right now, you can see the conversation being had based on the last article I put out. I've discussed it on Twitter. Following the loss to Washington and sort of what we've seen from the quarterback situation, there are a lot of people, Trent, that are looking at Sherrone Moore and placing blame on him for not being more aggressive in the transfer portal and going out and getting like a legit quarterback out of the portal. Give me your thoughts on that. We talked about this preseason. I think this has been a conversation quite a bit, and there is this narrative out here that Sherrone Moore really dropped the ball by not getting a guy in the spring. What would you say to those folks?
Well, when you talk about since he's become head coach, there wasn't a whole lot that he could do. Jim Harbaugh left late. They played the last game of the year playing in the national championship game. A lot of guys who transferred, like your Cam Wards and those guys, they've already made their decisions. They weren't available when Sherrone Moore accepted the job and took over. He had to go out and land guys like the Wesley Walkers and CJ Charlestons and guys like that who were still out there in the portal. I don't blame any of that on Sherrone Moore. There was nothing that he could do about it. Here's my issue. Michigan knew what they had in J.J. McCarthy. So this goes back to Jim Harbaugh, his time here at Michigan. They knew what they had in J.J. McCarthy. They also knew what they had after J.J. McCarthy, which obviously was not very much. So why you're not trying to bring in guys to be a backup, recruit these? I know they tried to recruit top end guys like Dante Moore, and he didn't go to Michigan. But why you left the cupboard so bare at the quarterback position for Sherrone Moore? That's my gripe. So that goes back to the Harbaugh era of things. Sherrone Moore, when he took over as head coach, there was nothing that he could do at the quarterback position.
Right. And you have all these people that like, he should have gone to the portal. I mean, dude, I had one person suggest that Sharon Moore should have picked up a transfer portal quarterback who committed to a new school in December. Michigan was still playing football at that point. They hadn't even gone through the transition at that point. So if you have a gripe with not going after portal quarterbacks that early, your issue is with Jim Harbaugh. It's not with Sharon Moore. And Trent's right. Jim Harbaugh was officially announced the head coach of the Los Angeles Chargers on January 24th. 2 days later, Michigan announced Sharon Moore as the head coach on January 26th. Go back and look at the portal commitments and tell me which quarterbacks were available after January 26th that you think would have given Michigan a far better shot to win than what they have now. Keep in mind, Michigan is 4-2. So really what you're saying is this guy would have taken us from 4-2 to 6-0. Tell me who that quarterback is. And by the way, when you're going through that list, also tell me, were those guys interested in Michigan? Would they have passed admissions at Michigan? There are so many other factors that go into it other than just, I mean, a lot of people look at this like it's a video game. A list pops up, you look at who you want, you pick him, boom, he's at Michigan. That's not how that goes. There are so many variables that go into finding a guy and bringing him to Ann Arbor. And when Sharon Moore took over the job, most of those hurdles that you had to go through were out of his control. Could he have gone out and gotten a transfer out of James Madison, who's now at Texas State? There seems to be a general belief that, what the hell is his name? What's that quarterback?
I don't know.
You don't even. Jordan McLeod. Jordan McLeod,
yeah.
Who's now on his fourth collegiate program, transfer from James Madison. There's some that believe that, well, that's the difference right there. Sharon Moore should have gone after Jordan McLeod from James Madison. Now he's out killing it at Texas State. So obviously that means he would be killing it here at the University of Michigan.
Yeah, they're so good. They've lost 2 or 3 games already.
I mean, he's on his fourth program. He's out there balling out at Texas State. Surely it would have worked here at Michigan. I don't think it's overly complicated what happened here. When you take a look at it, and I put this out in the article, and there were a lot of people that didn't comment before reading the article or ever reading the article, which is par for the course. People just take the title and they want to say, look, Sharon Moore is to blame for the quarterback situation. By the time he took over, any option that Sharon Moore would have brought in at that point was a project at best. Were there some potential solid options? I'm talking like 2 or 3, maybe. But there's no indication that those guys had any interest in the University of Michigan, and we already know that Michigan isn't going to pay a guy up front to get him out of the portal. So take that off the table. I think what happened was Sharon Moore took over. And by the way, all while he's trying to figure out the recruiting stuff, he's also got to try to find a way to build his staff, because it's not like Jim Harbaugh just took all of the guys at once. It was a very piecemeal approach. It was Jesse Minter one day. Then it was Clinkscale the next day. And I believe Clinkscale left after having a meeting with the team saying that he was going to stay. Was that not part of the story there? Clink, I think he had gotten with the team, told him he was going to stay. And then maybe 2 days later, 3 days later, he was like, sorry, I'm out. Then you lose Ben Herbert. So it was a very piecemeal approach. And all the while, Sharon Moore's having to play catch up and go out and find coordinators late in the year. So I think Sharon Moore sat back and he said, look, quarterback options we've got right now, Alex Orji, Davis Warren, Jack Tuttle. I think after Saturday, Trent, it's a pretty safe assumption that Jack Tuttle was always supposed to be the guy. There were things that I saw from him that I have not seen from another quarterback this year. Leads me to believe he was supposed to be the guy, and I think Sharon Moore felt that. But what happened was Tuttle had an injury. The recovery from the injury was far more complicated than anybody anticipated, and that put Sharon Moore in a tough spot during fall camp of having to decide between Davis Warren and Alex Orji. And I think he gave those guys both a legitimate shot to try to solidify the starting job, and they couldn't do it. So 6 weeks into the season now, we saw in week 6 what we were supposed to see in week 1, which was Jack Tuttle out operating the offense. Now, I understand people want to criticize Jack Tuttle for making those mistakes, and those are certainly a part of his performance. But there isn't anybody that can sit back and watch what he did on Saturday and say he is not clearly the top quarterback on this roster. And so I think it'll mean good things for the Michigan offense moving forward. And I don't know that there's anybody in the portal that would have come in and been able to perform better than a healthy Jack Tuttle had Michigan had him available throughout the duration of the season. Now, does that mean Michigan beats Texas? I don't know. Maybe they have a better shot to do that. Does it mean if Jack Tuttle plays a full 4 quarters on Saturday versus just half of a game against Washington that Michigan gets the W? I'm not so sure, because the Michigan offense also stalled out with Jack Tuttle in the second half. So this idea that a transfer portal quarterback from James Madison, who's now at Texas State, is the difference maker in this team, I think you're stretching and reaching for anything you can find as the reason why to blame something on Sharon Moore. When the reality of it all, when you boil it down, this is still very much Jim Harbaugh's football team and what he left behind. And I think Sharon Moore is doing as much as he can possibly do with what he has to make it work. And I'll give Sharon Moore credit for this. It's not like he's married to, I mean, we saw Jim Harbaugh, like when he was committed to a QB, he was committed to a QB. Sharon Moore has now made 3 coaching changes within 6 weeks, right? He gave Davis Warren the shot, didn't work. Brought in Alex Orji, didn't work. Now he's got Jack Tuttle in here. So Sharon Moore is willing to shuffle the deck and try to put people in that he thinks will do better for Michigan. But ultimately, what he has to work with is what he has to work with. And the guys that are currently in Ann Arbor are there because Jim Harbaugh brought them in. Sharon Moore does not have his first recruiting class in Ann Arbor yet. So if you got any issues with the roster, particularly the quarterback room, you got any problems with that, or you're frustrated or angry about that, your frustration and your anger should be directed at Jim Harbaugh, not Sharon Moore.
I fully agree. You said something about Sharon Moore basically has a team that Jim Harbaugh left here. It's more like what he didn't leave, because we see so many pieces that either that went with him to Los Angeles, or that weren't recruited properly, just like the quarterback position. Like, Harbaugh knew what he did or didn't have after JJ McCarthy. Like, yeah, Jack Tuttle was here, but is Jack Tuttle a healthy Jack Tuttle? Is he going to lead you to the promised land? I tend to think no. I don't think he's probably a quarterback that he'll put you on your shoulders and throw you to a national championship. I don't think he's nearly like a JJ McCarthy. And Jim Harbaugh should have recognized that. He also knew what he didn't have with Alex Orji in the passing game, Davis Warren, Jaden Denegal. Like, he knew that. And that kind of goes back to the 1 foot in, 1 foot out. He was always looking at the NFL, and right. He ultimately left, and this is what Michigan has.
Yeah, and look, even in saying that, it's like there is blame to be placed on the feet of Jim Harbaugh. Like, he is responsible for some of it, but it's even that is not as simple as people would want to make it out to be, because I think if not for, and I'm not going to go down this rabbit hole too deep, but I'm going to dip my toe in a little bit. If not for the shit show of Connor Stallions and the NCAA investigation and all the crap that came from it, and Jim Harbaugh wanting assurances that Ward Manuel wasn't willing to give, then probably Jim Harbaugh is still here. Like, I don't know exactly, if he got those assurances. It sure sounds like, and I can't remember the title of the book that came out, but there was it sounds like Jim Harbaugh would have preferred to stay at Michigan, but it just seemed that it wasn't a tenable situation, that at some point the NCAA was going to be, and we saw what the NCAA did with the recruiting infractions, right? The 4 years show cause, the suspension. So there was no realistic scenario where Jim Harbaugh was going to be able to remain at Michigan, even if he wanted to. So it is so much more complicated than just, Sharon Moore could have gone out and gotten all these guys out of the portal. Like, that's just such a simplified way of looking at what became such a complicated situation toward the end of Jim Harbaugh's tenure. There were a lot of moving pieces. There was a lot of uncertainty. There was an NCAA investigation. There was a head coach who was flirting with the NFL. And even at that point, there are some believe that Sharon Moore should have gone rogue and started acting as the head coach before he even got the job. Who's to say he would have gotten the job? You're out there recruiting on behalf of somebody else, and tell me how you're going to walk into a living room and pitch that to a potential recruit. Well, yeah. I don't have the job yet. I'm not really sure what Jim Harbaugh is doing. We're not really sure what's happening with the program in general, but we think you'd be a great fit here in Ann Arbor. You guys just have to be a little more realistic with how things work in the real world. And if you can do that, and you can look at all of the different situations that were going on, you can sit back and say, look, I think Sharon Moore is doing the best with what he has. Now, it's on him, right? He made the coaching decision to elevate Kurt Campbell. He made the coaching decision to bring in Wink Martindale. This staff is his decision. We're 6 weeks into the season. Let's see what he decides to do with that. If he decides to hang on to guys and it doesn't work for the remainder of the season, then I think there's real question marks about Sharon Moore. And is he putting loyalty above what's best for the program? But we are not at that point yet. You got to give this guy more than 6 weeks to be able to read.
If making a quarterback change has anything to do with it, you're going to think that he's going to make the best move for Michigan moving forward, even if that means coaches, because like you said, he's already changed quarterbacks 3 times in 6 games.
Yeah. I mean, listen, the easiest thing to do would have been to settle on a center, but he's continued to shuffle center. He's willing to do things on the offensive line. I think Sharon Moore, it doesn't seem like he's as hard-headed as Jim Harbaugh. The fact that Sharon Moore even had a conversation with Dave Portnoy tells you everything you need to know about the difference between Sharon.
Harbaugh been like, "Who's this? I don't know you." Bye.
I have no interest in talking to him. You know what I mean? Like that. I give Sharon Moore a chance. That's all I'm saying. Just give him a chance and stop simplifying everything to where he could have, once he took over on January 6th, gone into the transfer portal and pulled out, gold nuggets left and right. He did try to be active in the transfer portal. They brought in 4 guys in the secondary who damn near haven't played a snap all season, right? Amir Hall's the closest, and he wasn't even available last week. He has tried to do things to supplement the roster, supplement the coaching staff. It's clear that there are issues, and it's clear that there are things that need to be fixed. Michigan is now going into the bye week after half the season. Let's see how they respond. Let's see how Sharon Moore responds. If it doesn't change, if it doesn't look any different, at the end of the season, the expectation is that Sharon Moore is going to need to make some changes. And if he doesn't make those changes, then I think it's a fair conversation to really, is Sharon Moore the right guy for the job? Is he doing the right things? But we are way too early to have that discussion when it comes to him in particular. You can have it about Wink Martindale. You can have it about Kurt Campbell. Can't have it about Sharon Moore just yet.
Yeah, because if the offense doesn't get better, you're potentially looking at a move there. If the defense doesn't get any better, you're potentially looking at a move there. And then it's just all about, who does Sharon Moore bring in? Does he make moves? What kind of moves does he make? He's the head coach. He's basically the GM of this team. And just give him time. Give him a couple years at least. I'm kind of still in the mindset, though, if this season continues poorly and say Michigan goes 7-5, 6-6, next year goes the same way, I think then you might start looking at a potential head coaching change. But you got to, in my mind, you have to give Sharon Moore at least 2 years and be patient with him and see how it goes.
Yeah, and Larry from the Facebook page, he says, Chris, you really can't know what Jim wanted to do with all the NCAA shit coming down on him. He just about needed to go. He got what he wanted, I would think, but we sure aren't better for it right now. Yeah, first, the first part of your statement there, try to get into go ahead, go inside the mind of Jim Harbaugh and tell me what it's like in there. It's like I don't know, terrifying. If you could shrink yourself down and go in there and just explore the mind of Jim Harbaugh, there's no telling what's going on in there. And right, we don't know exactly what he wanted to do. I think it's probably fair to say, and we know this by his own admission because he said it openly, that Jim Harbaugh always had an itch to return to the NFL. He always wanted to go chase the Lombardi Trophy. That's always something that has been a part of him, and that's been reflected in his actions by continuing to flirt with the NFL year after year. But I also think it's true that there was a part of him, given that Michigan had reached the mountaintop, that maybe he wanted to retire a Michigan man, that he wanted to keep it going, but that the stuff from the NCAA just wasn't going to go away. And there was no chance for him to be able to continue on forward without having to deal with all of that. So, yeah, to your point, an ideal situation, and this is something that hasn't happened since the 90s. You go out and win a national championship, you retain your entire coaching staff for as much as you can, but you certainly retain your head coach, and then you run it back the following year. That's the standard protocol for how it works after you win a national championship. Michigan is pretty much in uncharted territory, certainly nothing that has ever happened in the college football playoff era. And is Michigan better off now than they would have been with Jim Harbaugh as head coach? Probably not, but you also have to acknowledge that the NCAA thing was never going to go away. It was going to keep being a thing with Jim Harbaugh here. So is it better off that he's not here? yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think that's where you have to settle on that. This was a move that had to be made. Now you can make a I guess, a decision, or it can be a debate on whether or not Sherrone Moore was the right hire. And I would argue that given the circumstances, he probably was the right hire. But ultimately, I think it just became clear that that Jim Harbaugh did not have a future at the University of Michigan with the way things were at the end.
Yeah, and then also, if he does stay, you're talking about it would be a yearly thing. Some NFL team would contact him. He would go for an interview. Maybe he rejects it. He comes back to Michigan. You're going to have the same thing every single year. Recruiting, it dipped down because of it, and it would continue to dip down because you don't know who you're committing to. Where I do believe, I know it looks bleak right now, but I do believe that Sherrone Moore will recruit better than what Jim Harbaugh did, as long as he can win games. I think that he will recruit better because players know that Sherrone Moore is going to be at Michigan.
He will recruit better, but part of that is they have to perform better.
Yep.
And that's where I think Sherrone Moore has to be very aware of what the situation is, because it's quite likely that Michigan is not going to go to the college football playoff this year. But you have to show, particularly from an offensive standpoint, that you are willing to push it, that you are willing to try things, that you are willing to attempt things. And I think if you can show a willingness to try, that becomes far more appealing to sell that to a recruit and say, that deep ball we didn't connect on, that's one that we can see you making a play on. We're willing to make those plays. We need to find the right guy to make them, and we think you're the guy to do it. But it's real hard to pull up the tape and watch Tyler Morris block for, 45 minutes and then get one attempt to him that's 10 yards off the mark. Right. That's a hard selling point. So I think that's where Sherrone Moore needs to make a decision that, look, we don't know if it's going to work or not, but we're going to try. We're not going to use that uncertainty as a deterrent to not even try these things. And when you've got a former Wolverine watching a game saying, like, did we even try to throw the ball down the field? Like, that goes to show you it's not just crazy fan talk. Like, people that play the game at a high level are wondering why Michigan isn't making these attempts. And Trent, you talk about it. Amarian Walker comes into the game for like a play and he gets a 22-yard reception and it looks great. And then we never see him again. He is the tallest Michigan wide receiver target. He might be the most athletic, yet we have not seen him all season long. That just seems very, very strange to me. So for sure, that type of thing is definitely on Sherrone Moore. Mindy from the Facebook page, she says, not sure that the NCAA would have issued the show cause ban had he stayed. It was an impotent flex. Trent, you know something about that. They gave that they knew would have no impact. Look, I'll say this. I do think that maybe the severity of it was because Jim Harbaugh was no longer there and trying to send a message. But let's be honest. The NCAA was very much intent on coming after Jim Harbaugh. Like, that is clear to me. So the idea that had he stayed, the NCAA would have decided to be more lenient on Harbaugh and Michigan, I think that that's probably a pretty tough case to make. It became pretty apparent early on. I mean, keep in mind, Jim Harbaugh served the 3-game suspension self-imposed to begin the year because they couldn't come to terms with the NCAA. So Michigan just said, well, maybe if we do the self-imposed 3-game thing, this will go away. It didn't go away because the NCAA was not finished with Jim Harbaugh and Michigan, and that was just for the recruiting violations during the 2020 COVID year. Didn't have anything to do with Connor Stallions and sign stealing and all that other shit. So I don't want to go full, Buckeye scoop and sound like that turd, but it very much feels like the NCAA was intent on getting Jim Harbaugh for something. And so, yeah, I mean, we can debate would the severity of it been a little bit different? Maybe, but I mean, there was no chance. Even his own lawyer, Jim Harbaugh's own lawyer, was essentially telling him, like, if you come back to coach, there's a chance you're going to be sitting out for half the season, like a 6-game suspension. And that's maybe like an at best scenario type thing. So these were the people advising him that cared about him, that wanted to see him succeed, but also giving him a very realistic picture of what he was facing based on conversations they were having with the NCAA. You are looking at a 6-game suspension at a minimum, could be worse. And then if you're Jim Harbaugh, I mean, I don't know. Are you really going to return to Michigan for that? You're getting no assurances from your athletic director other than, yeah, we'll make you the highest paid coach in the Big Ten. We're not going to give you any protections. And if the NCAA issues some sort of show cause or whatever it is, like contract is null and void. We're not going to give you those protections. Or you can go coach out in LA with the Chargers. It just seemed like a pretty simple decision for Jim Harbaugh there.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think maybe the severity might have been a little more just because he left, but I think he's getting hit regardless. I think the NCAA for a long time now has been out to get Jim Harbaugh, and they finally had a reason to do it, and they were going to get him no matter what he did.
This is tricky. CJ from the Facebook page, he says, you got to inject some positivity in before we end this, please and thank you. And not Mariah Carey Christmas music. Okay, we're not going to do that quite yet. But, all right, as we are now at an hour and 4 minutes, and I think that we can just continue to go on and on and on and on about this all day. We do got to inject some positivity. We got to find a way to do that. And I'm trying.
Well, I think Michigan, I think they putting Jack Tuttle in the game. I think you saw a little bit of a different Michigan offense. They were down 14-0. They went ahead 17-14. I do believe that he's going to give you the best chance to win. You're obviously going to make him QB1 going into the Illinois game. That was just announced for a 3:30 kick time, by the way, in 2 weeks.
Love it.
But I think that you're going to finally see this Michigan offense have a little bit of life in it. And then maybe if you can, that defense performs better too, because they're not going to be on the field as often and as long either. You just got to get something from the quarterback. And I do think you're going to see more going forward with Jack Tuttle.
Yeah, complementary football, I think, can do a lot for a football team. And I think you're right, Trent. I think that we are going to see that from Michigan moving forward. And the good news is that it's happening at a bye week, right? Michigan now has one loss in the conference. Again, 2 losses on the season, but just 1 loss in the conference. I will say this, that if they can get 150 through the air, and we keep hammering that number, if you can get to 150 through the air, it is going to open up things for the rushing attack. It does mean the Michigan offense will be putting up more points on the board, and it is going to give the defense more of a breath. And I think if you can play more balanced football, I'll say this, Trent, I don't think we have seen near as good as this football team can perform. What the potential is there. There is so much meat left on the bone. And if they can get it figured out, I think a lot of it starts at that QB position. And what can you do in the passing game? And if you can do that, it helps the running game. If you help the running game, you help the defense. I mean, everything sort of complementary football is critical, especially in today's era of college football. So I do think that's the good news. And I'll say this. I think we're now at a point in the season where, and I said this after the loss to Trent, do you agree, by the way? I mean, you're a fan. You've experienced pain as a fan, painful losses, right? I mean, what's the most painful Michigan loss you think you've ever experienced?
Man, off the top of my head, I think it's got to be the Michigan State game, the trouble with the snap. I think it's got to be that.
Yeah, I would agree. 2015 for me, Michigan State, definitely the most pain I've ever experienced as a Michigan football fan. I understand it wasn't the most consequential, and a lot of people want to point to 2016 Ohio State, but dude, and I've said this before on the show, I feel like it took me 2 weeks to just recover from 2015 Michigan State. Like, I was in such a state of disbelief, depression, whatever. And then, 2016, the spot with JT, although I didn't blame the loss on the spot like a lot of you guys out there. I mean, interceptions and fumbles and shooting yourself in the foot. That's what cost Michigan that football game. But yeah, that was a painful loss. And then look, after the last 3 years, after that Washington loss, watching it from the couch, standing up in my living room, screaming at the TV obscenities while my 10-year-old son, which by the way his birthday was on Sunday. Happy birthday to you, Sully. But he's sitting on the couch. I'm swearing at it felt good to be a fan again. But then once the game was over, the game was over. And then I went to wrapping presents and I moved on with my life. I just feel like the success from the last 3 years, I don't really feel pain the way that I used to feel pain. And I think it's okay to hang on to that happen. I mean, Michigan won a national championship 9 months ago. It's going to take, maybe 2 or 3 years of what we've seen so far through 6 weeks before I really start to have an emotional issue about it. And I saw people on social media, they were like, that's a loser mentality, already given up on the football program. And it's like, I wasn't aware that Michigan's success on Saturdays was entirely dependent on my emotional well-being.
Well, now that you can change it.
How I feel on Saturdays has zero impact on whether or not Michigan is going to win. But Yeah, I mean there are people like Larry that say it still hurts. Did you feel that level of pain after the Washington loss? To me, it was like once the clock hit 0 and I switched it to a different channel, it was over for me.
For me, man, since I've started covering Michigan, it's kind of made me switch from that out of control fandom to it's a game, I got to write about it. Like, so the game ends and well, that sucks, but time to get to work. And you start writing about the game. And then we came on live and talked about it. I don't get overly emotional about losses like I used to. And same with the wins, though. Like Michigan wins the game and it's awesome. They won, but time to get to work. I got to write.
Got to write something about it. Yeah. I mean, I think that's, that's your dose of good news, CJ, is that it's still very much okay. For as much as those shitheads down in Columbus try to convince you otherwise, Michigan is still the reigning national champions right now until somebody else has crowned it. So you can very much lean on that national championship. You can very much flex it. Hell, we've seen Ohio State fans flexing a national championship from over 10 years ago. This is a team that hasn't won anything of value since 2019. And because they spent the first part of the season beating up on MAC teams, including Michigan State, and then got a home win against Iowa, we're all supposed to be impressed. They haven't done shit this year. So until
Let's see
otherwise,
what they do this week.
These two programs, right, we'll see what they do against Oregon on the road this week, and they're still going to have to play that football game in Columbus. And here's where I want to end it, Trent. If Michigan can find a semblance of a passing attack, and they can be more of a balanced team, given Michigan's struggles, do you think that there is more or less pressure on Ryan Day and Ohio State to get that win now? We knew going into the season that there was going to be some hype for Michigan, but now through 6 weeks, I think everybody's comfortably writing Michigan off as they are not a legitimate contender. Do you think that scenario, coupled with the fact that everybody's on Ohio's, look at how incredible Jeremiah Smith is and Will Howard can do this and they can do that, do you think there's now more pressure on Ryan Day and Ohio State given the circumstances?
Yeah, I think so, because clearly it looks like Ohio State is head and shoulders better than what Michigan is. And if the trajectory continues going the way that it is, and Ohio State drops that game against, at this point, you could be talking about a 3 or 4 loss Michigan team, then yeah, that's not good for Ryan Day and Ohio State. That's not good at all, especially being in the shoe. So I think he already had pressure on his shoulders to win the game, but I think that it's a ton now. It's like a mountain on his shoulders that if he doesn't win this game, he's gone.
Yeah. And, ask Alabama if it can happen. Ask Georgia if it can happen. I mean, close scares there. So, you got a pissed off Michigan team underachieving, nobody giving you a chance in Columbus. And we'll see what happens in November. But very much so, you can still lean on the happiness from the national championship season. And you can also take into account we're only 6 weeks through the season. Michigan's 4-2 going into a bye week, and there's still a whole nother half of regular season football to play. You got Oregon, you got Ohio.
What if they went out, Chris? What if they went out?
What happens if we went out, huh?
What happens if Michigan wins out? Like I said last show, I'll tell you what happens if Michigan wins out. If Michigan wins out, they're going to Indy for the Big Ten championship, and they will be in the college football playoff. And so you got to hold on to hope, damn it. That's it, CJ. That's your positivity. Cling to hope.
No Christmas music today? I was pumped.
Listen. You asked for it. This is how we're gonna roll out the show on a Monday afternoon. We appreciate, look, man, everybody that was in here, highly active comment section. These things are so enjoyable. We're going to continue to do them during the afternoon. Appreciate everybody for being in here. We will be back on Wednesday at noon for Fan-Led Wednesday, favorite day of the week. You guys bring, oh shit, I should have got the longer version of that. Well, let's run it back. You guys,
keep playing it. Just keep playing.
You guys bring the comments and the topics. We will do our best and probably fail to get to them all, but we will see you on Wednesday at noon. Until then.
Don't care